6:03, so we'll begin. First, wish everybody a Chag Hanukkah. I don't give Sameach right now, but that's a different story. But so Chag Hanukkah to everybody. It's kind of hard for me to believe this is the fourth time that we're doing this, and we're doing it every 2 weeks, which in and of itself says a lot about what's going on. The Army has just announced today that expect war 2024 to be a year of war, which is not exactly encouraging, to say the least. So where do we stand right now? Right now, our troops in Gaza are fighting in three places, the two areas in the north and Khan Yunis in the south. It is taking longer than was first expected or talked about. One of the negatives I've gotten to know over the years is the Israeli war correspondents are never critical. It's a sort of an amazing thing. They're mostly spokesmen for the army. They get their information, and that's how they keep access, but they're hardly ever critical. So before the last ceasefire, they basically told us, and I wrote this, that the areas in the north, 2 out of the 3 would be completely completed before the ceasefire, and the last area probably in the week after. Well, we're, I guess, 2 weeks plus after the first ceasefire, and one of the areas was completed earlier. The other area and the other 2 areas are still heavy fighting going on. Khan Yunis are talking about a month. It's one of these difficult trade-offs, because the reality is, by acting slowly, we're still keeping casualties relatively lower. I say relatively because the casualties are beginning to add up. There's no question about it, but they're relatively less than one would expect in an urban warfare environment. Part of that reason is because, first of all, a lot of the wounded are saved. As the years have gone by, battlefield medicine has improved drastically, and Israel actually has a number of innovations in that area. And so a lot of soldiers that might have died in previous wars are being saved. So that's a very good thing. But it doesn't mean the fighting is any less intense, and the fighting is intense in all of these 3 locations. The single biggest problem is there is no plan for the day after. And that's really the problem. In other words, it's really hard to win a war when you do not know what you're trying to accomplish for the day after. All we have so far is what we don't want. And what we don't want is various things. We can go into that later, but the current government, in my opinion, is incapable of coming up with a plan for the day after, because the current government would fall if they come up with a plan for the day after, because part of this government wants basically to annex the Gaza Strip. Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they want to resettle the Gaza Strip, and Gaza should always be part of Israel. Obviously, that's not a realistic position. It's not a position favored by 80% of Israelis. And I'm sure even Netanyahu doesn't want to do that, but he doesn't want his government to fall. So anything he presents would result probably in his government falling. And of course, if there are new elections, we've seen all the polls, they are not going to be in power. So that's one of the big problems. It's one of the big problems also the United States keeps on coming back to each time to Israel and says, okay, we're willing to help you, willing to support you. We'll say there's more time. We're not putting a limit on how long you have to do this for, but please tell us what your goal is after the fact, because military victory is only as good as the political solution that follows. Now, it does mean a political solution. I mean, a political solution means a political solution to the to the Israeli-Palestinian problem, because that's what it is at this point. And there isn't going to be one anytime soon, in my opinion. But you still need to have a plan. So what are you going to do in the meantime? And we do not have a plan for what we're going to do in the meantime. I do not believe the government has had any serious discussion whatsoever about that. It would be leaked. There's no secrets these days in this government. It'd be leaked. It has not taken place. And of course, we're 8 weeks more into this war and no plan, no idea where we want to go after the fact. So that's the single biggest problem we have, beyond the fact that street fighting, house to house fighting in an area full of tunnels and full of IED devices everywhere is a major challenge, and it's very, very time consuming, much more time consuming than any of us would like. We clearly would all prefer this thing to be over much quicker in so many different ways, but it doesn't look like it's going to be. And the army said today to expect that Hamas still has 300 to 400 long-range missiles that can hit Tel Aviv and medium range that can hit places like Ashdod. I don't know. That's their estimate. Their estimates have never been all that accurate, so it's really hard to know. I know sources in Gaza claim that they're still making rockets underground. So if they're still making them, who knows? The question is, where can they fire them from? Can they fire enough of them? Obviously, the numbers have been very, very low in the last week, but every couple of days they seem to surprise us, like they did on Friday. So it's ongoing, it's long, it's grinding out, and it's not at all clear when it's going to end. The army is saying it needs 2 more months in order to finish theoretically in stage 1 of Gaza. That's a long time. That will mean it'll be in a 4-month war, Israel's longest war, with the exception of the War of Independence, which is a whole other story. And of course, that had all sorts of different phases and everything else. But we're talking about a war that'll last at least 4 months, and they're really talking about even longer than that, because we're not even dealing with what's to be in the north. And the north presents an impossible problem, because right now they decided to evacuate all of the towns and villages along the northern border, which makes sense at some levels. On the other hand, the people are saying, well, I'm not going to go back until the problem is solved. The problem being solved is basically moving Hezbollah troops back above the Litani River, as the UN resolution called for. So we're talking about using diplomacy to accomplish that. Is that possible? I don't know. I think it's not likely, but it's possible. Some people are saying we need to go right to war with Lebanon, and we need to do it with force. The problem with going to war with Lebanon right now is twofold. Number one, if we initiate, I'm not sure how much the United States will be supporting us. And number two, I don't think we're ready. We used up an awful lot of our interceptors during this war. I have no idea what our production capability is. Whatever it is, we need, if we're going to have a war with the North, we need a lot more interceptors. And so we need to be producing a lot more interceptors. Besides all that, I personally believe we have to wait until we have our laser defense system deployed before we'd even think of taking on Hezbollah. But that's my opinion. But we don't know what is the solution to the North at this point. Is Hezbollah just going to stop? People are going to move back? Have we created a buffer zone inside our own country? These are all difficult questions, and we do not have solutions for any of those questions right now. And I don't see any immediate solution on the horizon. I mean, the government keeps saying, well, let's deal with Gaza first, which makes sense, absolutely. But Gaza is going to keep on going for, as they say, at least another 2 months. And then, of course, we get to the hostages. And what, if anything, can be done about the hostages right now is very unclear to me at the moment. I don't know that, first of all, I don't know if it's possible to have a ceasefire where we are right now, in the positions we are right now. I'm not sure it's a good idea to even think of having a ceasefire, and the other side doesn't want a ceasefire, at least at the moment. So I don't know, and it's a very hard problem. It's a very hard problem. Almost 100 soldiers have given their lives so far in Gaza. Do we do that, and then do we allow out thousands and thousands of terrorists from our prisons in order to release? We don't know how many hostages are still alive. I'm sure a lot of them are not. That, unfortunately, seems to be the reality. I've actually been quite surprised by the fact that Hamas has not been engaged in more psychological warfare against us, showing videos of some of the women soldiers or the other women or whatever it might be, which leads me to be very concerned about their safety and whether they're even alive at this point. So these are real concerns, and there are no easy solutions to any of these things at the moment. It's just a question of hoping for the best, hoping for a breakthrough, hoping that one of these times the mission succeeds in terms of rescuing them. I don't really know. I said before, and I say it again, I would happily be the president of the United States. I would not want to be the prime minister of Israel at this point, having to make some of these decisions, because there are no good solutions. There are no good decisions. They're only choosing between bad decisions. And choosing between bad decisions is always a hard thing to do. And there's no perfect path forward. The next thing to talk about briefly is our dear friends in Yemen, the Houthis, who are obviously doing what they do at the behest of the Iranians. They are becoming annoying. Let's put it that way. That's one way of putting it. In two levels. The missiles they fire so far with no success. One thing has been proven is that the Chetz missile system seems to really work. But each time they fire one, I don't know exactly how much a Chetz costs, but I think it's north of $1 million. So every time they fire one of these missiles, we spend $1 million knocking it down. Not pocket change. I mean, it has to be done, obviously. But it does give us a certain level of confidence in its Chetz's ability if the Iranians ever fire missiles at us. Of course, one at a time is a lot easier than if multiple missiles were fired simultaneously, but let's just hope it works as well against multiple missiles as it has against single missiles. Now, the threat of shipping, the fact that they've attacked a number of ships, and their statement yesterday, I guess it was, that they will not allow any Israeli ship that is coming in or out of Israel to pass the Red Sea, that's a real threat. It's already raised the shipping costs to Israel considerably. Those have gone up, sea rates have gone up. That is an area that we have to rely to a large extent on the United States for. The United States has been the keepers of the free seas against pirates, etc., since the early 1800s. The Barbary pirates was the first time the U.S. Navy America actually took offensive operations outside of the United States. And certainly since the United States replaced Great Britain as the keeper of the seas, the United States has taken that mission in a serious way. They're also the only real country that has any true ability with a really blue water navy to do it. Although, interestingly enough, the French today supposedly intercepted a number of drones, attack drones, that were heading towards a French ship in the Red Sea. So the French are involved, the British are involved. The United States is talking to everybody to talk about a joint action against the Houthis. We'll have to see. Again, you get back to the problem. The real head of the octopus is Iran, but no one really wants to go to war with Iran at this point. So it'll be easier to go to war with the Houthis. But keep in mind, the Saudis failed for so many years. When they tried to take on the Houthis, they were unsuccessful. So we don't have to, but we should leave it to the Americans if we can. I mean, we have Navy ships that can obviously reach that far. The new SAR 5 Navy ships have basically blue water Navy, and they can clearly go down the Red Sea. Our Air Force can reach there, but it's so much easier for the Americans to do it. And so the question is, does the American administration have the will? I think in this case they do, but time will have to tell. Which brings us, of course, to the American administration and the Biden administration's continued support. From time to time, they keep on talking about keeping civilian casualties down, and it's a problem. I mean, when they talk about that, I think they're talking about it from a good place. In other words, they're worried for us. They're worried for our image, which we sometimes aren't worried enough about. I sometimes have the sense that we rather explain ourselves as opposed to taking proactive measures. Proactive measures would be us creating a field hospital for Gazans or something else. And that maybe not that specific, but doing active things to show that we are helping the average non-Hamas Gazan. It's complicated. The Israeli public would object to some extent. Certainly the far right would object. But public relations and Hasbara are not only explaining how bad the other side is. It's also showing things that show the good things we're doing, whatever they may be. It's difficult in war. And it's certainly difficult in terms of the number of people that are dying. We can't get around that fact that an awful lot of Gazans have died, or civilians, in what's called collateral damage. Now, whose fault is it? Well, clearly, if Hamas didn't, operate within the civilians, this wouldn't happen. But that's the reality, and we've had to deal with that for the last, I don't know how many times we've dealt with Gaza. Every single time it comes down to the same thing. So that's really a significant problem in terms of Hasbara, in terms of public support. Look, we had the United Nations resolution yesterday, 2 days ago, I guess it was. All the countries have voted in favor of the resolution. Many of them were, of course, relying on the U.S. veto. They knew it would never pass, and therefore they could vote vote for the ceasefire, tell the domestic audience in France, let's say, look, we voted for the ceasefire, we're in favor of the ceasefire, knowing very well that that resolution was never going to pass because the United States was going to veto it. It's potent, right? Who doesn't want a ceasefire? Right? Everyone wants ceasefire. So wants war to continue. It really sounds pretty bad, right? So it's a great lie. Ceasefire now, ceasefire now. The implications of a ceasefire now is something else altogether, and that's something that most easy people, or most of the people who don't think clearly or think through the implications, don't seem to understand. I don't think they understand, or anyone understands, too many people understand, the fact that from our perspective, yes, we don't have a plan for the day after, but eliminating Hamas is a plan in and of itself. It's only half a plan, but it is a plan. In other words, we've concluded that Hamas cannot be an organized government on our borders in any which way, and they cannot be a military organization, and we have to do everything we can to eliminate that. And I think the American administration recognizes that. I think most countries, the governments recognize that, but the people in most countries want a ceasefire. They want to stop seeing the images of dead children on their screens, something we don't see in Israel very much. All the screens, everything that you see, I listen to the NewsHour with NPR it's as a podcast the next morning, but I don't see the images. I just hear it as a podcast, but I can imagine the images they're showing as they're describing what's going on in Gaza. You may have, outside of Israel, may see some of these images. We basically don't. And so Israelis don't understand sometimes why people are upset, because Israelis don't see the images. We don't see the effect of what we do. It doesn't mean it's not ultimately the right thing to do, or the only thing we can do. I won't say the right thing to do, the only thing we can do, but it's still a little problematic in understanding the circumstances of the world, because people don't get it. It's like when I was on I-24 last night after the show. I was on with a guy who was a security analyst, former intelligence guy, and we were talking afterwards, and I was trying to explain to him that there's very little we can do to improve our hasbara when people are seeing these images on the screen every day. It's really throwing something up against Niagara Falls, basically. It's very, very difficult. It's very, very challenging. And yes, people understand that we have to eliminate Hamas, but they want to understand, why can't we do it without hurting anyone else? I mean, it seems logical, right? But obviously it's not the case, and some people understand that. But that's the challenge. Prime Minister Netanyahu today called President Putin of Russia. I'm not exactly sure why. Supposedly he yelled at him for their position. I don't know if he really yelled at him or not. One thing has been very clear, this fantasy that some Israelis had that we could walk the line between the United States and Russia and get Russian support and not worry about the United States. We can always get Russian support, I think has become very, very clear in these last weeks that we only have one set of allies, and that's the West, and we only have one superpower that's our ally, and that's the United States. And any attempt to gain favor with Russia is a waste of time. And of course, I always thought that our position on Ukraine was indefensible. But that's just me. But I've thought that for all along. So we're seeing how much it's helped us to be, not to take totally the U.S. side and not to take the Ukrainian side when it comes to Russia in reality. I'm actually impressed that they spoke for 45 minutes, but that's a different story. The next question to bring up really is domestic politics here. It's one of these strange situations. Every time one of the questioners on when Netanyahu has press conferences, which he's finally started having, says, you only have support of 25% of the people, don't you think you need to basically resign is the bottom line. And he says, I'm not involved in politics. We're only here to win the war. I don't get involved in polls and everything else. Well, yesterday there was a meeting of the Likud party. And what did they do at the meeting of the Likud party? He introduced deep dive on internal polls that the Likud had done. So much for not polling. Obviously, much of what he's been doing has been to try to position himself the day after to blame everybody but himself. I don't think it's going to work. We're talking about basically a very small percentage of the people in the country want him to remain as prime minister, although most Likudniks do. So I don't think he'll be able to withstand the storm that will come at the end of this war, but I don't know. He's obviously been a survivor. He was written off many times before. I don't know. This is, of course, by far the worst situation that any prime minister has been in. I think in Israel's history, obviously, it's the worst situation we've been in Israel's history. So that's where the politics of it stand at the moment. The people in this country, I think they did a survey and they decided between 35 and 40% of us suffer from PTSD. In some form or another, that is true. In some form or another, the TV, well, we're all drawn to watch the news, and all three major networks, or I guess there are 4 networks now if you include 14, basically have news on all day long and into the night, and it's all news, news, news. They fill it with all sorts of stories of survivors, stories of heroes, but also with every single funeral, basically, that takes place of all the soldiers at this point. And not the full funeral, but excerpts from every funeral. And so if you throw everything that happened on October 7th, you add watching funerals day by day, it's really hard not to get depressed. No 2 ways about it. It's hard to keep on going in a way that says it'll all be okay. The famous Israeli saying is "Yeh beseder," and Yitzhak Rabin always thought that was the worst thing on earth to say, because he said, when you say "Yeh beseder," it means I don't need to do anything. It'll be okay, so it'll be fine. I rarely hear anyone saying "Yeh beseder" these days. People talk more about, well, there'll be better times ahead. We hope so. I don't know. And then the other weird thing, and most of you are abroad, although some of you are here, is this tremendous rise in anti-Semitism all over the world that has come at the same time of the war. And I was talking to friends of mine from the neighborhood, I guess it was Friday, and they actually had been planning to go to Germany for a couple of years. They had gotten some inheritance from one of their mother or father. I think it was the mother died and left them an apartment which they were selling, and they had inheritance, and they were going to spend 2 years in Germany because why not? She's a graphic artist, he's an engineer. Why not live somewhere else? She says to me on Friday, I've never felt, until now, I didn't really realize why there was a need for the state of Israel. And I'm really glad I'm here and I live here and not anywhere else in the world. And this is a very secular Tel Aviv Israeli who, seeing the anti-Semitism in the world now, I don't know whether it's been taken out of extreme here. It's not covered that much in the Israeli press. It's like every couple of days it's covered in a big way. The congressional hearings of the university presidents were covered briefly, but it is covered, and there is a realization that something different is happening in the world, and it's having it's a strange effect in Israel, because under normal circumstances, that same person would be saying to me, I've had enough of the war. I don't want any more. I'm going to Germany next week or whatever it would be, as soon as I can. But the general reaction has been the opposite. So that's both encouraging and discouraging, depending on which way you look at it. Look, to be quite honest with you, I've been surprised. Someone who's studied American anti-Semitism in America for a long time, not that I didn't think it existed, but I've been surprised by the extent of it, that started coming to the forefront, before, but increased when Trump was elected on the right side, and then on the left side, it's been there for a while, but coming, at 1,000 miles per hour during this war, and so that's been surprising, and it's been so strong on both sides of the political spectrum. I think kind of scary, especially since the middle doesn't seem to be holding the United States, generally speaking. So that's in and of itself a problem, but that's a different problem altogether. So unfortunately, I fear we'll be doing this for a couple of more alternate Sundays into the future. I don't see when this comes to an end. I really don't. I hope it comes to an end sooner rather than later. Obviously, we all do, but I don't know. I don't really know the scenario how it comes to an end quickly. I don't think if you would have told anybody on October 7th, even before October 7th, obviously no one would even imagine we'd have a war. But after even October 7th, if people would be thinking that, 2 months later, more than 2 months, 2 months and 2 days later, we'd still be deep in a war, I don't think anyone would believe it. I mean, the 6-day war took 6 days to conquer everything that we conquered. Now it's a different story altogether and different issues, but still, 6-day war, even the Yom Kippur War was 40-odd days. So here we are, way beyond that, and basically we've conquered, I don't know, 40 square miles, 50 square miles, some small, some relatively small area. Difficult area, but still, it cannot be said that we've changed the face of the Middle East in the last 2 months. So all of that, I will end on that sort of, I won't call it depressing note, but a note of reality. And at this point, I'll have questions. Unmute yourself, and I'll try to find you. I don't have Amy Lieberman.
Hi, firstly, thank you. I really appreciate these calls. I have the same questions I probably have every week, which I know you don't have any answers to. I know you mentioned the hostages, and I'm sure there's not much more you could say about them, but they do concern me. And also, I always worry about like an all-out war, and I'm just curious now that things have continued, if there's any thought on your part of that really being a possibility.
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the hostages, again, we know very little about their the actual state of them. Like I said, I fear that more of them are not alive at this point. And so that's of great concern. I don't see the scenario where we find that, another ceasefire and another agreement. I mean, the only agreement that I see that's realistic is we allow the Hamas leadership to leave Gaza without killing them in return for releasing the hostages. I can't imagine Israel at this point agreeing to what's called kulam avor kulam, which means all for everybody, that at this point, after being this deep in Gaza, losing 100 men, we're going to release 4,000 terrorists. Because I don't know, maybe they would, but I don't know. What might have happened at the beginning, but at this point, it seems to me unlikely. And also, it's be very hard to stop at this point where we are in terms of the warfare. So I'm skeptical. Now, as to all-out war, it's a question of what does that mean? So it hasn't happened until now. Let's start with that factor. If Hezbollah wanted an all-out war, they should have attacked us the day that Hamas did. That day we were not ready. If they would have attacked in the north on that day, they might have had the same success, give or take, that Hamas had in the south. But at this point, there are hundreds of thousands of troops on the northern border, so the ability for them to do something, is limited. Well, I don't see that happening. Could I see a situation where they won, if Hamas is about to fall, whatever that means, and Iran, and they all say, well, we're going to start attacking if you don't stop, and they actually go through with that? I guess we could see a scenario like that. I don't think it's likely, but it's clearly possible. What's going to happen with the Houthis? Will that turn into an all-out war? Again, the Houthis, I mean, it's really, they're basically a terrorist group that has part of a country far, far away from us. So they can't really threaten, they threaten us by sending these missiles. But again, I believe it's going to be up to the United States and its allies to take care of the Houthis. And what that means, again, I'm not sure, because like I said, the Saudi Arabia had a very poor record of doing that, to say the least. So I don't see an all-out war, but again, we're always war. It's a concern. It remains a concern. It'll be always a concern, because I don't think our ability to ascertain intentions is all that good these days. Let's put it that way. Nancy, I think you had a question.
You mean in the chat? Okay.
Yeah, I guess yeah.
Okay, thanks. So it seems to me Israel seems to think that it can determine the timeline, but the situation is not static. It's not totally in Israel's hands. The humanitarian situation is apparently getting worse and worse. So might that precipitate kind of international pressure that would lead Israel and Hamas to agree to another pause to bring in a considerable amount of humanitarian relief, and also open a window for discussion of bringing more hostages home?
I don't really see it. Hamas doesn't care about the humanitarian situation. Let's start with that. They want it to be as bad as possible. So that's number one. Number two, Israel could bring in more humanitarian relief if it decides to do so. It should do so, frankly. But there's a problem at this point. How does it get distributed? Where does it get distributed? More to Rafah, I guess, more to the refugees on the edge, absolutely. But it's kind of limited. I don't see the humanitarian situation. I don't know. It's hard to see that being a defining moment. I think Israel needs to take some positive action in terms of the humanitarian situation itself, and not leave it to others. But one of the problems in our current government, and even our war cabinet, we have a war cabinet that may or may not be very good in terms of generals, the good generals in there. But other than Durner, who's basically, he was an ambassador to Washington. He's Washington's favorite Republican. Let's put it that way. He has strong ties to the Republican Party, so he has those abilities. But we don't have a strong foreign minister. In most situations, you have a foreign minister and part of the war cabinet who's going to be saying, you know what, this may be what you want to do in terms of the war, and this is the best thing militarily, but hey guys, what about the humanitarian situation? What about our image in the world? And maybe we should do something else a little bit, and having that impact. We have nobody making that. We have no one institutionally in our war cabinet at all who fulfills that role, and that's a problem, because even if most of their ideas might not be taken, at least some of it would be taken, and maybe we would do certain things. So we'll see. Ronnie, man.
Hey, hi Mark, how are you?
Okay.
Hope you're well. Is there any talk of opening up the Israeli lines to let the civilians onto the Israeli side of the lines and then bringing humanitarian aid in that way? And that's number one. And number two, is there any talk that it's impossible to root out Hamas? I mean, Iwo Jima, took 7 weeks and it had nothing compared to this, and cost 7,000 American lives and 25,000 Japanese lives with no civilians. I mean, is there any talk that this is just an impossible military task?
Okay, so two things. First of all, by the way, in Iwo Jima there were civilians. There were about 10,000 civilians died. There were civilians in Iwo Jima, but that's a different issue. Okay, so let me go to the first one first. I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to set up a huge tent city inside the Negev for these people, but that would get all involved in right of return and all sorts of issues that are really complicated and politically complicated. And certainly within this government, I wouldn't even think they're smart enough to do that. But so it's a good idea. I don't see it happening. Is it militarily possible? Let me put it two ways. There are less Hamas people than there were Japanese on Iwo Jima. Number two, I don't think Hamas is as crazy as the Japanese were on Iwo Jima. As much as I'm not a great lover of the logic of Hamas, I don't think they're quite as insane as the Japanese fighters in Iwo Jima were really quite, I won't say insane, but they were way out there in terms of their devotion and the devotion of giving up their lives. I mean, that was considered the highest. Now, some in Islam and Hamas believe that too, but also, the terrain was also very different. Also, you couldn't bomb the in Iwo Jima. They were deep inside deep inside tunnels, inside mountains that were 100% rocks. Excuse me. Also, the U.S. didn't have the firepower that Israel does over Iwo Jima. I mean, the amount of firepower we're using is ridiculous. I think it's almost way too much, but we're using a tremendous amount of firepower and we have it. But your question, though, is a broader question. I think we can root out the military aspects of Hamas and eliminate all their military infrastructure. I think we could eventually destroy all the tunnels and find most of their rockets and everything else like that. However, Hamas is also an ideology and it's an idea. Now, you can't destroy an idea. All you can do is say the idea doesn't work and get people to leave the idea because it doesn't bring success, it brings just failure. But again, you need to replace an idea with a different idea. And so unless we come up with a different idea, it'll be almost impossible to do that. Ian Joseph.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Mark, I just want to, maybe it's a comment, maybe it's a question, but lack of a definition or an objective for the day after is not really just the day after. It's lack of an idea, an objective and definition for the year after, the decade after, the century after. This is like 75 years, 50 years, 56 years, whichever anniversary you want to choose, of ongoing of the same thing over and over and over. And it's not enough to keep doing the same thing, taking the Jabotinsky iron wall policy and approach that through our force of arms, we will get them to realize that we had to stay. That's just not working because this just keeps repeating itself ad nauseum. Anyway.
So I would disagree that we've continuously used that position. I think that Likud may have that position, but remember there were other alternative parts of our history. There was Rabin with, of course, the Oslo Accords, which people could not say was a good or bad idea, but he never got to live through to take it to the next step. We had Barak, who basically gave them the two-state solution, and was willing to go, very, very far in the two-state solution. And then there was the Clinton plan afterwards that went a little bit further. That was as far as anyone could possibly imagine Israel going. And you even had Olmert's plan, which was even a little bit further, which was basically equivalent of 100% of the West Bank and Gaza with land shifts. So I don't accept the idea that it's always been the Jabotinsky iron fist and they'll eventually accept us being here, because I agree that will never work. That hasn't worked. But on the other hand, every attempt at a two-state solution has failed also. I mean, remember, this whole thing would have never happened if the Arabs of Palestine at the time, because I don't think they even considered themselves Palestinians back then, but the Arabs living in Palestine would have accepted the partition plan of the United Nations. History would have been very, very different. May not have been what they would have really liked. It may have not been what they would have hoped for, but they would have had a state back in 1948, and it would have grown side by side with a much smaller Israel, because the partition plan gave us less land than we ended up with after the war. And history might have been very, very different, but they refused to accept the partition plan the same way they refused to accept the Peel plan in 1936. In 1936, Lord Peel suggested that the Jews get their own state, basically between Netanya and Tel Aviv. That was basically the state, but it would have been a state for all of our for the European Jewry to come to. I don't know what sort of state it would have worked out to be, but the result with the Arab revolt and the Britain backed down from that plan very quickly. So I don't think it's been the Jabotinsky's disciples have had mostly control of this country the last 40 years, but there have been breaks when they haven't. And in every time they haven't, there's been a proposal put forward that would have brought us along to the two-state solution. But you have to have two sides to agree to a two-state solution. And now, when we have not found anyone willing to accept the two-state solution, that does not include the return of refugees. That's one of the key factors. Then, I don't know what the solution is. You're right. This can't keep on going. But on the other hand, you need, I believe strongly the only solution is a two-state solution. But I also don't believe a two-state solution will happen in my lifetime. My lifetime, may be, it's not that much longer. I mean, I'm planning on dying any soon, but still, I'm not a young man anymore. I hope it happens in my children's lifetime. I'm not particularly optimistic, but maybe my grandchildren's lifetime, there'll be a two-state solution, because there is no other solution. But you're right. This can't continue. You want a plan for the day after the day after. A plan, but the plan has to be implemented. And also, I keep in mind one other thing: the politics here are very complicated right now, because on one hand, the current government is hated, but no one trusts the Arabs either. So it's not clear what sort of plan even a non-Bibi government can put forth that would be accepted by the people of Israel right now. So it's not good. What can I say? Paul.
Yeah,
Right.
so Mark, in the West, and I believe most of the world, two big words you hear these days are settler colonialism. Okay, and you can disagree with me, but I think that most of the world, and more than 51%, believes that Israel is a settler colonialist nation. And if you do believe that, even if you are, even if you think that what Hamas did on October 7th was horrendous, you do have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the Palestinians and for Hamas. Okay, so my question for you is, if Israel cannot break this psychological barrier that the world views it as a settler colonialist nation, I think things are just never going to get better. But if Israel can do that, and we believe it's not a settler colonial nation, I think it could really sway the world. So, if you were setting Hasbara policy, what would you do to try and move that along?
Okay, so we get to problem number one is it doesn't make a difference what fact sheets I would come out with, what great TikTok videos I would develop, what all the media you could possibly come up with. The question is who's going to watch it, who's going to see it, and who's going to be affected by it. And therein lies a number of problems. So on one hand, we have a problem in the university system with this whole idea of colonialism, settlers and colonialism and all the things, terrible things the West has done, and we throw Israel in with all the West. That's taught in many of our best universities these days. So that becomes a problem because some of our biggest, our quote unquote smartest kids are learning mostly nonsense at this point in terms of history. They don't learn history. We all know that. History is not something that students learn, whether it's in elementary, middle, high school, or in college. They don't know history. They don't learn history. So if you don't know any history, you can just, learn this philosophy, and it looks very clean and very, very obvious. Look, I wrote the other week about a small survey that was done on college campuses about to the river, to the sea, and they were asked, and they, it's like 68% of college students said they liked, they supported that idea, and then the person doing the survey started explaining what it meant. Most of them didn't know what rivers and seas they were talking about. So, okay, so you don't know geography, that becomes a problem. And then when you explain to them that to the river, to the sea means the elimination of Israel and the people in Israel, then suddenly 68% of the people who supported to the river, to the sea, said that they no longer supported that. They didn't want that. So the problem is, how do you reach these people? How do you reach this young generation? It's primarily the young generation. We look at the differences, it's primarily the young generation. We're seeing, so much of them get news from TikTok, and so much of that's controlled by algorithms. It's a very, between TikTok and university professors, it's a really big challenge. But you have to work at it. You have to find ways of working at it. But, it's not more, look, Israel's always failed at Hasbara. I remember arguing 40 years ago or 30 years ago when I was involved in Hasbara in America, and Israel was spending like, $1 million a year. And I said, hey, listen, guys, we get $2 billion a year. That's what we're getting back then in aid from the United States. Any, first year business student knows that when your income is $1 billion or $2 billion, you're going to spend, at least 5% on advertising, right? Marketing, advertising, at least 5%, or maybe 10%, but at least 5%. That means we should have been spending $100 million a year in Hasbara. But people would think that's absurd. But that's what we should be spending all the time. We should be spending huge sums of money. I don't trust this Israeli government to ever be able to do that. I think we need to find, to a large extent, people in the advertising community to try to help us. But that's what's necessary. No small campaigns and going around and speaking, etc., is going to make a huge difference. You need a massive campaign, thoughtful campaign, educational campaign, and not a propaganda campaign. A campaign.
But it should be done. I'm sorry to interrupt, but a full court press like that, it should be. It's way past time, but now it's more crucial than ever.
Absolutely, but I'll make you, knowing the people, the players that at work here, I just don't see it. I don't see them doing it. I don't see them spending the money. I mean, frankly, I would think American Jewry should take all the money they're sending to Israel, not send any of it to Israel, spend it all on education and education for Israel in America. That would be a much better investment than all the money that's being sent to Israel right now. I think sending money, Israel needs money. Don't get me wrong, but on the other hand, Israel can always borrow more money at the moment, but it's not going to spend the money in investing it in our future. And I think American Jewry needs to do that. But again, it would be very controversial. But I literally think they should take $100 million and spend it on education on history, and education on the conflict, and all of those things. You spend $100 million, you might get some results. But you got to do it smartly, obviously, as well. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Someone else is raising their hand and the computer's not telling me who that is. Joseph, okay.
Hey, Mark, thanks for doing this again. I don't know if this is neither here nor there, or if you know anything about this, but how is the morale of our soldiers, given the fact that so many are reservists and not, active duty, young active duty soldiers? Is there any discussion on like how they're obviously they're in war and that's a given and they're stressed, but if this goes on for months and months, how's their mental
I don't know. I mean, look, the initial result, everyone talked about the high motivation and everything else, and everyone's highly motivated, and all those sort of things. I would have to assume they're still highly motivated. You're right. As time goes on, it gets more difficult. Most of them get a chance to cycle out for at least for a long weekend. And again, as opposed to World War II, where American soldiers were gone for years at a time, Israeli soldiers even in war managed to cycle out for short periods of time. But look, it's difficult. I don't think we're doing enough to deal with the family issues when they're home. The home front. In other words, people have businesses, all those sort of things. Those are all difficult things, and I'm not sure we're doing enough about that. But generally speaking, at the moment, it seems to be positive and good. If this goes on for months and months, I don't know. Israel's not used to that. So this is a very different situation. But I do think we'll also manage to switch out some of the troops at some point. They're talking about trying to do that. Look, it's costing 2 billion shekels a week for having reservists in, this number of reservists in the army. So that alone, forget aside the munitions and all the other costs of this war, but that is 16 billion shekels just for the direct costs of having reservists in the army, and that doesn't even include the money lost in terms of their productivity and all those other things. Theo.
Hey, so I've never said this in public, and I didn't think it for most of my life, and I probably wouldn't say it if you and I did not have a 40-year friendship where you know me to be an ardent Zionist and a former Olah and a passionate lover of Israel. But I'm trying to read a lot of I have unfortunately been reading a lot of the literature, and I'm brought to that famous statement that's been brought up many times of Golda's, which is that we have a secret weapon. We have nowhere else to go, right?
Right.
I think probably, and my ultimate result is I don't care, but I think probably we are a colonial power. We are a colonizer. We were we were people without a land, and we went to what we believed was a land without a people. We were wrong. And those people, after we got there, developed a nationalism, a self-identity, and they tried to rise up, but we quashed them, right? And secondly, we have not been giving Israeli Arabs 100% rights like Israeli Jews have, and we've treated the people we occupy even way worse than that. But the question is, if we want a Jewish state, do we have a choice? I don't know. But when you think about the perspective that, for example, and I have a couple American Jewish college students are getting in terms of the literature they're reading, their TikToks and everything, they see that without harboring an innate, not my kids necessarily, but an innate love for Israel and an innate sense or an educated sense that particularly after the Holocaust, we had nowhere to go. And if we are out in the world without Israel, we are weak and we will assimilate and we will be no more, or at least Israel will be no more. So I mean, coming from me, it's probably somewhat surprising, but I just want to put it out there that, even I'm thinking this way. So imagine non-Jews and people who don't care about Israel.
Okay, so let's take that apart for a moment. Number one, look, we've actually done well by the Arab Israelis. We haven't done as well as we could have, but we've done awfully well by them at this point. 50% of the pharmacists, 20% of the doctors, you can go through. Tel Aviv University is almost 40% Arab Israelis. Haifa University is 50% Arab Israelis. The birth rate among Arab Israelis has dropped to, normal Western standards, which means the women in the Arab Israeli world are living Western lives economically and everything else. It took us some time. We didn't do it as well as we could, but we've done well by the Arab Israelis. And we look at the results of the surveys of this time. more of them these days identify as Israelis than they do as Arabs. So I would put that part aside. I think we've been very successful in terms of Arab Israelis. It took us a while. And we certainly had our problems in the first 20 years of the statehood until 1960. Or less than 20 years, that's 12 years. But at any rate, but I think we've done well. I think they've done well. We could always have done better. It's always a challenge when you have a minority group and you have issues of national ties and everything else. In terms of the Palestinians, listen, I always thought we made a mistake in the fact that we didn't treat, we didn't make them think that they were in heaven, and treat them wonderfully. But, it's not easy to be an occupier in any which way. And again, it's an occupation we didn't want. Just remember, in 1967, we were willing to give up everything but Jerusalem and maybe the Golan Heights right after the 6-Day War in return for peace. That was our position right after 67. We were not interested in keeping any of it. But we ended up keeping it because no one was willing to negotiate with us. And we've had that time and time again. So we're stuck occupying these people. It's not easy, to be honest with you. There's no good occupation. There just is no such thing as a good occupation. I don't know how you do that when you have a population that's not, doesn't love you. A lot of them want to kill you. They certainly did in the first and certainly second Intifada. So it's not a great occupation. It's not good to occupy, but we don't know how to get out of this occupation. Leaving aside the crazies on the right who want this occupation because they believe we should have all the land. But leaving that aside, we don't want to keep on occupying them. But we don't know how to stop occupying them and not be killed. I talked to some of the people before this war. I used to go to this group that was every single week demonstrating opposite the defense ministry, and I forgot the exact name, but basically it was to see what we're doing in the territories and the bad things we're doing in the territories. And I'd say to them, okay, well, what would you do? How do you solve this? Show me a plan where we leave the territories and we are able to ensure our security. And so the best plan someone came up with amongst these people was, well, we should turn it all over to the Palestinian Authority and they'll take care of it. Really? They were going to take care of it? So there was no plan on the far left. What we can do, the current situation stinks, but that's what it is. As to colonizing, I don't think the definition of colonizing actually works because the colony, by its nature, has a home country, and it's a home country that's coming to colonize a different country, and plus making use of the natural resources, other resources of a country in a colony for the good of the home country. That's what colonies have been in history. So we're not colonial. It doesn't say we're not something else, but we don't fit into the definition of colonial. Are we indigenous? Well, some of us are indigenous. Some of the families here go back 15 generations. Most don't. But then most of the Palestinian Arabs, only about half of them or less than half of them actually can trace their ancestry in Palestine from before Jewish immigration started. At least half the Palestinians came from Syria and other places when the economic development of Palestine took place after Jewish immigration. So what are they? Are they colonizers too? So yes, we displaced a certain number of Palestinians. They didn't have to displace any of them if they would have agreed to the original plan. The United Nations looked and looked and looked and couldn't come up with any other plan that was better than dividing the land for two people who they both said had rights to the land. Both the Jews and the Arabs had a right to the land, and therefore they partitioned it. We accepted, they didn't. That's just an historic fact. So look, if we made mistakes, of course we've made mistakes. If we go back in history, you certainly would have changed it. If Likud had never been empowered at any time, that might have also changed things. But that's the reality. We've made mistakes. But overall, look, the Palestinians are the people, in my opinion, who have the least right to a state anywhere in history. They're the ones who brought international terrorism to the world stage. They are the ones who brought hijacking and blowing up planes to the world stage. They are the ones who turned down every agreement that was presented to them over a period of time. I think they do not deserve a state, but I still want them to have a state because I don't have any solution other than giving them a state. So, look, you can cherry pick our history and say we're colonialists, but I don't think we're colonialists. A lot of us came from somewhere else, but so much of the world came from somewhere else, right? I mean, how many countries can people track their, other than Native Americans and lots of other places, places like that, but the world has been full of immigrations and migrations and people moving throughout the world. They've been throughout Europe and everything else. So yes, we moved. A lot of us came from somewhere else, but that doesn't make us colonialists. That's a new term that's been developed on college campuses and other ways to define us. And so I don't accept that. I accept we've made mistakes. Clearly, we've made mistakes, and I wish we could have done better. Maybe we'll do better in the future. But I don't accept the fact that we're colonialists. I accept the fact we've made mistakes. Clearly made mistakes. Anyone else? Okay, so I thank everybody.
Wait, me.
Go ahead.
Hold on. Hi. I just want to say one thing, finish off what you just said. I think every country makes mistakes. I think the US made plenty of mistakes with the Native Americans, and every other country in the world makes mistakes in the course of history. So hold Israel to a standard that is not relatable to or comparable to any other country in the world, that's racism, anti-Semitism, and every other ism out there.
Sure, absolutely the case. Okay.
Thanks, Dad.
That's a good place to end it. So we'll meet again in 2 weeks, I'm afraid, unless the war ends, which I don't think is going to happen. So thank you all for participating. I will be posting this. I have probably a very brief update tonight, which will be this video and just a few other matters. And the regular update will be tomorrow. So thank you all for participating, and see you all in 2 weeks, I'm afraid.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Take care. Thanks.